Hello and welcome to everyone. My name is Eleanor McDonald. I'm here today to chair today's teach-in. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming today. I want to begin with an acknowledgement that today's event is taking place on lands that were originally and still remain home to the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee of the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg, specifically the Mishisagig and Algonquin peoples, as well as Indigenous peoples from other territories who live and work on this land, once known as Cataraqui. I wish to acknowledge their stewardship of this land from time immemorial. I also wish to acknowledge the history of settler colonialism, in which their historic relationship to the land was devalued, dismissed, and denied, in which treaties were broken, and in which practices of cruelty and abuse became common. It is a history not only of dispossession of land, but also of dispossession of culture, knowledge, and language. We are here today because we care about the mission of Queen's University to learn and to teach and to create an intellectual community for the benefit of all. In light of this, I also wish, as part of this land acknowledgement, to acknowledge the historic devaluation and appropriation of Indigenous knowledges and the invocation of their knowledges with care for the land and for community. I also wish to note that the budget cuts that we are talking about today threaten the recent institutional commitments of Queens to indigenization and colonization. In gathering for this teach-in, we can be mindful of our own relationship to this history and this land, and we can commit to the value.
I'm good. How are you?
Mary Louise, can you turn off your mic? Today's teach-in, in gathering for this teach-in, we can be mindful of our own relationship to this history and this land, and that we can commit to the values of truth, respect, and care that are needed for this conversation. Today's teach-in has been organized by a cross-campus coalition of faculty, staff, and students with representatives from QFA, from PSAC, and USW. I am incredibly heartened to see such a large audience. We are also being broadcast today on CFRC. I know we are also being joined by watch parties in several units. The cuts we are speaking about are not only a consequence of decision-making at Queen's, but they are also a consequence of provincial underfunding. Recognition of the importance of post-secondary education continues to be at risk at all levels of government, but perhaps especially here in Ontario, where the per-student government transfer to universities is the lowest by far in Canada. The purpose of today's teach-in is to share the knowledge acquired by these speakers about Queen's financial situation and about alternatives that may be available to the drastic cuts that are being proposed. You will hear from students, administrators, staff, adjunct professors, graduate student employees, and postdoctoral fellows, each of whom will discuss the impact of austerity on the quality of their education and the conditions of their work. Each speaker has been given a set amount of time, between 7 and 10 minutes. I'm going to introduce each of the 8 speakers before they speak. And I also want to say that there is time allotted at the end of all speakers for questions at that point from those in our audience. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to begin by introducing the first speaker, Dan Cohen, who is here from the Department of Geography and Planning, and Bertrand Malsch, who is here from the Smith School of Business. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleanor, and hi, everyone. So my name is Bertrand Malsch. I'm an associate professor in accounting at Smith School of Business. I'm here today with Dan from the Department of Geography and Planning. And so as Eleanor acknowledged it in her presentation, the financial situation of the universities is not necessarily good. And we acknowledge that there are certain pressures coming from changes in the funding from the government, diminution of enrollment in certain programs, challenges in accepting international students, and also inflationary pressures. All of these factors together create a very challenging environment for the university. And as a starting point, we don't really challenge that. The topic of our presentation today is more to question whether the only way to address these pressures or the cuts that have been proposed by the University of Administration. And as you will see from Dan's presentation, we believe that there is room to do things probably differently. So without further notice, Dan, the floor is yours if you want to proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Bertrand. I really appreciate it. It's been great to work with you. And so I wanted to start off with this quote from a rating agency because I'm associated with the QFA Finance Committee. That's the faculty association. You might be like, well, of course he's biased. And I think it's important to look at what independent rating agency has said for a couple reasons. First, that reason, it's an independent rating agency, and they say, Queens benefits from a relatively strong balance sheet and a large pool of internal reserves, which provides financial flexibility to endure a difficult operating environment, and this is key, without the need to make drastic cuts that could affect its core academic mission. And they place Queens within the context of other universities, saying, yes, Queens has one of the strongest liquidity positions of the university it rates. The second thing I think is really interesting about this is I do research on finance, municipal finance, school finance, and so on. And I've had the opportunity to talk with rating agencies, the people who do these ratings, municipal lawyers who talk with them. And one thing they always emphasize when I talk to them is our only concern, what our job is to think about whether or not this institution that we're rating can repay the debts. And so I found it very interesting that they said this thing about the academic mission. And I started thinking in my head, why would they say such a thing? And to me, what it reveals is the reality that making drastic cuts that affect the academic mission are also bad for the finances of the university. If we have things that are reported, like in the Queen's Journal, where physics labs are not being cleaned, that affects the university's mission, it affects the ability to provide an education, and in the long term, that affects the university's reputation and ability to generate revenues. And I think that's a really important thing to think about when we're thinking about these cuts from a kind of finances perspective. So I want to start off there, and I also wanted to do a little contextualization of the announcements about the budget crisis. First, as we just discussed, an independent rating agency has said the university has resources available to kind of address the deficit in a less drastic manner, maybe over a longer time horizon where we can address the revenue side, raise a little bit more money, and without needing to go right to these cuts. The second point is the deficit is often mentioned. We see the $62 million figure mentioned a lot, but it's important to note that this is a projection. This is not what has actually happened. It's a statement about the future based on assumptions about what is going to happen. And so going right to cuts based on this projection is something we need to think about, especially because over the past 6 years, we've seen that the university has overprojected the deficit by quite a bit, an average of 44 million per year. And indeed, in the email that everyone got from the provost last night, he said, you know, we're already down to a $48 million deficit from that $62 million projection. And so do we need to go right to $60 million of cuts over 2 years, or is there perhaps opening for a little bit more wiggle room there? And then the final thing we want to really address here are potential alternatives of ways of thinking about these budgetary pressures that we can reduce the level of these cuts and really protect the academic mission. And I can't really get into the full budget in 10 minutes, but I really want to focus on one illustrative example, and that's the university's pooled investment fund. And so I'm going to try to talk about this differently now that I know it's on the radio, because I have some graphs here. But what I really want to highlight here is that this is an investment fund that the university controls. It's not the endowment. This is university funds, and it's grown from $245 million in 2017, 2018 to around $560 million, according to the latest figures. And so the important thing here is to realize and recognize this growth. So what is in the pooled investment fund? Well, according to Queen's investment funds policy, it's an investment vehicle that contains restricted and unrestricted fund balances from a variety of areas, such as research projects, operating carry forwards, capital reserves, and so on. And that payouts from this fund are used to support current operations. What's key to emphasize here is this isn't $560 million that the university can just draw upon however it wants. It's a pool of funds, some of which are restricted, some of which aren't. So it's not, what we're talking about here isn't that the university has $560 million it can draw upon necessarily. What we actually want to talk about is how the investment income of this fund is budgeted for. Because when you have a $560 million investment fund, you produce quite a lot of income just from investments. And currently, the way the university budgets for this income is they've set the value saying, we're just going to receive $5.2 million. We're just going to budget as if we're going to get $5.2 million a year from this $560 million. And that's an annual return of under 1%. And I can go into a TD Bank tomorrow and get a GIC of 5%. So this is a very, very conservative estimate. As the budget report from this year said, this is typically lower than what the university actually receives. And in fact, if we look over the past 4 years where there has been this growth in the fund, the pooled investment fund has earned 67.7 million against this budget income of 20.8 million. And so we see quite a bit of growth. And I recognize what the provost said. I'm glad we're able to have this open conversation about market volatility. But with the endowment, we do manage market volatility. And with this high level of income, we can put some aside for years where there's less investment income. So I think that's important context. What I also think is important is in the past, Queen's has raised the amount of money it budgets from this investment income from up to that 5.2 million. So in 2016, 2017, the budgeted income from the pooled investment fund was increased from 4.2 to 5.2 million because the amount of money in the fund had increased from 155 million to 210 million. So Queen's was receiving more investment income based on its size. They budgeted for a 2.5% return at that time. But since then, the value of the PIF, the pooled investment fund, has increased to 560 million, and we've never increased how much we're budgeting income from. And so we didn't meet the precedent that we saw in 2016, 2017. And I know the provost answered this question in his FAQ, but I still didn't get an answer about why it was appropriate in 2016, 17, and why it's not appropriate now. And I think that's a valid question for us to ask. This leads to very kind of strange things once you start looking behind, if you're like a weirdo like myself, and start looking at the details of how the Board of Trustees receives its financial projections. So up on the screen, what you'll see is the report of the financial committee or the financial administration to the Board of Trustees. This is the latest one. It's from prior to year-end, financial year-end last year. And you see they're saying, hey, we have a projected deficit of 24.6 million. That's lower than budgeted. That's consistent with prior years where we budgeted for 43.5 million. And then highlighted in the yellow, you'll see something very interesting where they say, well, the pooled investment fund has actually earned 18.5 million so far this year. But because we have this instruction, we're only reporting the deficit as if it earned $5.2 million. And so these accounting decisions make a difference about how we project the deficit, how we understand Queen's financial situation. I think this is quite important to understand. And so this is not just a critique. I think the question we need to be having as a university when we're thinking about the academic mission is, well, what can we do to preserve the academic mission? And how could we be using the resources we have differently? And I think this is a debate worthy of having as a university. And so if the university just simply met what it was doing in 2016-17, increased the budget income from the pooled investment fund to that 2.5% return, which is still quite conservative. Everything above that could still go into capital reserves. We would raise the budget income from the pooled investment fund to 8 million. That could reduce some of the operating budget pressures. And I know the provost said in his email last night that this money goes into capital reserves. But as recently as 2021, there was a decision by the Board of Trustees to use investment income to offset a budget deficit. And so I think we can have these open debates about what we need to prioritize: capital reserves, operating budget deficit. This is something worthy of discussing. And I think I'm glad the provost sent that email because we can now have this type of discussion. And so I think we could think about using these funds, for example, through the university fund, which coordinates other investment incomes and disperses it throughout the university. So with that, I'll pass it on to Bertrand.
Thank you, Dan, for this very informative and well illustrated reasoning about all the things that could be done a bit differently. But I guess our two takeaway messages here are really first, the idea of a budget crisis is to a certain extent always constructed. It reflects certain calculations, but these calculations are not just fact and truth that we should accept without questioning. They reflect some subjective views, some judgments, and these can definitely be challenged as we've just done in this presentation. So we believe that there are alternative strategies available to the university to mitigate budget pressures, definitely. And I think on top of it, we need more transparency from the university's leadership to explain in greater details and more convincingly how this deficit is constructed, and if we really need to go through these drastic cuts. So that's all for us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan Cohen and Bernard Malsch, for your important and analysis of the budget and your assessment of alternatives that Queen's could be taking to the cuts that the administration has proposed. I'd like now to introduce Bronwyn Bjorkman. She is from the Department of the Department Head of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures.
Great. Thank you. Just give me a second to get some slides up on the screen. Okay, so thanks very much for the introduction. I'm going to be talking about austerity, the current budget situation, and our academic mission, specifically from the perspective of a particular department. So I'm head of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, which is a department in the Faculty of Arts and Science. What else LSU is the department that does language instruction for all modern languages other than French, and associated literatures and cultures of those languages, as well as it's the home of the linguistics major here at Queen's. I'm here today to sort of put the budget situation that was sort of introduced in the previous presentation into context as in terms of what it means at the department level, and how the sort of drastic and abrupt way that austerity has come into being in arts and science and at Queen's, how that's affecting our sort of research and teaching mission as a university. So I thought I'd start, first of all, by talking about what our academic mission is. So some text from the university's strategic plan appears on the screen. This has sort of been boiled down into areas that I think we all agree are important at the university. We've got research, we've got teaching and student learning, we've got the integration between those things. Queen's is a global university that wants to engage globally. We also want to engage locally in our Kingston community, and we want to focus on our institutional culture. And all of these are things that are, I think, endangered in various ways by the current budget situation. So what the mandates are that are in place right now, as we're looking forward to future academic years, are, first of all the faculties at Queen's have been told to produce balanced budgets by 2025-2026. So that's not next academic year, but the year after that. In Faculty of Arts and Science, we're also being mandated to produce balanced budgets at the department level in that time horizon. There's a hiring freeze that has been mentioned. So as staff and faculty retire, they won't be replaced with critical positions accepted, though without sort of a lot of definiteness about what counts as a critical position and what doesn't. Also, starting next year, we've been told that no undergraduate courses will be scheduled if they have fewer than 10 students. Again, exceptions can be approved by the dean, but we don't have certainty or guidance about what an exception might look like yet. And then for grad students, grad courses, that's going to be 5 students coming into effect the year afterwards. So how do these budget cuts reach the department? So the departments are where teaching happens, where research happens. So at least in arts and science, because we're a departmentalized faculty, how does that flow down? The university allocates funding to faculties, one of which is arts and science. And in arts and science, departments get allocated funding. So when a department makes cuts, what are the types of cuts they might make? There are central services at the university. Lots of things are centralized, but a lot of costs and operations that might surprise you are devolved to departments. So when at the university level, the provost says no hiring, that means no hiring at the department level. Salaries and benefits for all instructors and all department staff are part of a department budget. Renovations to department spaces, including painting, or any furniture you see in a department, that's a department budget item. Labs or studio spaces for departments that have those are managed at the department level. Any special events, conferences, costs related to a one-time innovative thing that might be happening in a class, that's money that comes from the department. And even office supplies. So if we're going to have paper on which to print materials for classes, that is part of a department's budget. Those are not purchased centrally. So when we're asking what are we going to cut, we sort of have everything from people to paper clips, and we're very limited in what we can cut. So I've listed all these things that we spend money on. Actually, at Queen's, in arts and science, and in my unit, most of what we're spending money on is people. So it's people's jobs, people's positions. And we're very lucky to be working in a unionized environment. So we're the positions, how you add and remove staff and faculty positions is governed by collective agreements. And so units and the university don't have freedom to say, oh, we're cutting this professor position, or we're going to pay people less. That is negotiated with the university on a collective basis. And in fact, in the case of faculty, Queen's agreed to a new collective agreement just earlier this year. And so those costs are not ones that can be touched in the immediate term. At the same time, cutting paper clips, or even say a department not having a printer, those are things that are not going to get very far in terms of addressing the mandates to achieve balanced budgets. And that's what many units at Queen's have been grappling with. So where can we cut? If we can't cut certain things and we're forced to cut something, we are limited in the options. So staff positions are being cut in many units. What used to be, say, a dedicated department administrator, those positions are going away and not being replaced. Precarious faculty, so people who are teaching on a course-to-course or year-to-year contract, those are looking at being cut. The number of teaching assistantships available to grad students are potentially to be cut, especially anything that is, extra money available to grad students. And then funding for department and campus life that goes beyond the classroom. So these are things like special events, things taking place on campus, guest speakers and speaker series, student initiatives. So if a student organization comes to a department and says, we have a student journal, are you able to give us a little bit of money to support our operations? Those are the kinds of requests that departments are going to have a much harder time saying yes to right now. And innovative classroom experiences. If an instructor says, I have a great idea for something that students are going to do, but it's going to cost me a little bit of money to make that happen, those are the types of things that departments are going to have to start saying no to. So that's less exposure for Queen's. It's damage to the student experience, is a reduction in what students will experience as Queen's students on campus. And it's, fewer partnerships with local communities. So those are things that go beyond just the bare bones of what we do as a university. So what are the effects sort of beyond that going to be? So if we consider the hiring freeze plus deep reductions in term adjunct instructors and TA-ships, we've been told to anticipate a 13% reduction in the number of courses taught at Queen's over the next several years. So that means that a little bit more than 1 in 10 of the courses currently timetabled will not be timetabled in future years. So that's fewer choices for students in terms of what courses they're taking, and individual courses being larger. The fact that no courses with fewer than 10 students are to be timetabled, subject to be announced exceptions, that eliminates seminars in smaller programs. It also, in the case of my department, eliminates upper level language courses. So language courses, a lot of the languages we teach don't have a dedicated major. And so the number of students in each level is necessarily less than the one before. So the students in second year Spanish is a subset of the students in first year Spanish. So that top level of courses, those are always slightly smaller courses. And in all of the languages listed that we have, so 300 level courses in Spanish, German, and Chinese, 200 level courses in Italian, Arabic, Hebrew, those are all courses that have fewer than 10 students. And so they are potential targets of this. So again, I think this is a reduction in the student experience available at Queen's, the quality of the education students have access to, the opportunities our students have, and also damages our ability to engage globally. Unless Queen's is saying that what we want to do is we want to engage globally, but we want to do that in English or maybe French, which I think runs counter to our goals of being a diverse and working away from our colonial foundings as a institution. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about morale. So faculty, staff are being asked to do more and more with less. Faculty are being tasked to teach more students with less administrative support, cuts to office support or the supplies available in an office, fewer TAs. And so I think across faculty and staff who I've spoken to, there's a real feeling of damage to morale and this being a difficult time. And what does that mean? That means that somebody doesn't have the energy or the enthusiasm to create opportunities for students in classes and outside of classes. So that damages, again, the community and the opportunities we have on campus and as a campus community. Okay, so this sort of brings us back around to the question, does austerity sustain our academic mission? And our academic mission is back up on the slide for people who would like to read it again. So I think my hope and the hope of people involved in this conversation, as the last presenter said, I think it's great that we can have a conversation as a campus about what's important to us. What are we hoping to do as a university? I think my hope is that the Board of Trustees and the Provost can sort of look at how the ways that they're approaching the budget situation are affecting our academic mission. I think that these are people with what I hope or trust is the best interests of Queens in their minds. And we need to have a conversation as a community about what is most important to us and how can we sustain our research, teaching, and learning mission as an organization in the context of maybe cuts that we need to make, maybe even some that we want to make, but that we take the time to make those changes in the best way for us as a community and Queens as a university. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bronwyn Bjorkman, for analyzing the impact of these cuts on our academic mission. From the perspective of a department head, it's so important to know how this affects the kind of damages that may be done, including cuts to staff, to precarious faculty, to teaching assistants, to the number of courses offered, and to so many aspects of student life, community, and education, as well as to morale.